5 men. That's how many enforcers Dutch Schultz sent into Harlem on March 12, 1935, with one simple mission: find Bumpy Johnson, collect the protection money he owed, and if he refused, beat him into submission. 5 of Dutch's toughest collectors, armed with brass knuckles, blackjacks, and pistols. Men who'd broken bones and cracked skulls across the Bronx. Men who'd never failed a collection before. They walked into Harlem at 10 in the morning, confident, arrogant, ready to show these black gangsters who really ran New York. By 4 in the afternoon, all 5 were back in the Bronx, limping, bleeding, broken. One had a shattered jaw. Another had lost 3 teeth. A third had 2 broken ribs and a concussion. They stumbled into Dutch Schultz's office at the Harmony Social Club. And when Dutch demanded to know what happened, the leader of the group, a man named Vincent Cagney, said 7 words that would change everything. Boss, Harlem isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever. This is the story of the day Dutch Schultz learned that money and muscle couldn't buy Harlem. The story of 5 enforcers who thought they were untouchable. And the story of how Bumpy Johnson sent a message so clear, so brutal, that Dutch never tried to collect from Harlem again. Winter of 1935. The war between Dutch Schultz and Madame Stephanie St. Clair's Harlem numbers operation had been escalating for months. Dutch had been trying to take over Harlem's numbers racket since late 1934. The numbers game, also called policy, was generating millions of dollars every year. Poor folks betting nickels and dimes that added up to fortunes. And Dutch Schultz wanted every penny. Madame St. Clair had built the numbers operation in Harlem from nothing. She employed hundreds of runners, black men and women who collected bets from every corner of the neighborhood. And protecting St. Clair's operation was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 30 years old, former street hustler turned chief enforcer, the man who made sure St. Clair's runners stayed safe and her money kept flowing. Dutch had tried several approaches to take over Harlem. He'd offered to buy out St. Clair. She refused. He'd threatened her runners. They reported to Bumpy. He'd sent his men to intimidate the neighborhood. Those men ended up beaten or dead. By March 1935, Dutch was frustrated. His attempts to conquer Harlem through violence weren't working. His men were terrified to operate there. So Dutch decided to try a different strategy. He would target Bumpy Johnson directly, make an example of him, show everyone in Harlem what happened when you refused to work with Dutch Schultz. On March 10, 1935, Dutch held a meeting at the Harmony Social Club in the Bronx. He gathered his top enforcers. These were the men who handled collections, the men who convinced reluctant business owners to pay protection money, the men who broke bones when words didn't work. Dutch laid out the situation. Bumpy Johnson is costing us money. He's protecting St. Clair's operation. He's killing our men. He's making us look weak. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to send a team into Harlem. Find Bumpy. Demand that he pay us protection money. And if he refuses, you beat him in public, in front of his people. Show everyone in Harlem that Bumpy Johnson can be touched. Dutch looked around the room. Who wants this job? 5 men volunteered immediately. Vincent Cagney was the leader, 42 years old, 6'2", 220 pounds. He'd been collecting for Dutch for 8 years. He'd never failed, never been beaten, never backed down. With him were 4 others: Tommy Ricci, Angelo Martino, Frank DeLuca, and a young hothead named Johnny Silvestri. All experienced, all tough, all confident they could handle one black gangster in Harlem. Dutch gave them their orders. You go in tomorrow morning. Find Bumpy Johnson. Tell him he owes us $5,000. Protection money for operating in our territory. If he pays, great. If he refuses, you make an example of him. Beat him. Break something. Make it hurt. Make it public. The 5 men nodded. They'd done this hundreds of times before. This would be easy. March 12, 1935. 10 in the morning. Vincent Cagney and his crew drove into Harlem in a black Cadillac. They parked on Lenox Avenue near 135th Street, the heart of Harlem, the center of St. Clair's operation. They got out of the car, 5 white men in suits, standing on a Harlem street corner. Every person who walked past stared at them. They stood out like sore thumbs. Vincent didn't care. He wanted to be seen. He wanted people to know that Dutch Schultz's men were in Harlem, that they weren't afraid, that they were looking for Bumpy Johnson. They started asking around, "Have you seen Bumpy Johnson? Where does he hang out? Where can we find him?" Most people ignored them, walked past without answering. But a few pointed them toward Small's Paradise, a jazz club on 7th Avenue. Bumpy was known to conduct business there during the day. Vincent and his crew walked to Small's Paradise. It was early. The club wouldn't open for hours, but the door was unlocked. They walked inside. The main room was empty, just a bartender cleaning glasses. Vincent approached him. "We're looking for Bumpy Johnson." The bartender didn't look up. "Not here." Vincent slammed his hand on the bar. "Don't play games. We know he comes here. Where is he?" The bartender finally looked up. His expression was calm, almost amused. "You really want to find Bumpy?" Vincent pulled out a wad of cash. $500. "Tell me where he is." The bartender took the money. "He's upstairs. Back office. Second door on the right." Vincent smiled. He turned to his crew. "Let's go." They walked toward the stairs. What Vincent Cagney didn't know was that the bartender had just set them up. As soon as Vincent and his crew started climbing the stairs, the bartender picked up a phone. He made one call to Bumpy Johnson, who wasn't in the back office. He was 3 blocks away at a diner having breakfast, but he wouldn't be for long. Upstairs at Small's Paradise, Vincent and his crew reached the second door on the right. Vincent didn't knock. He kicked it open. The office was empty. Just a desk, some chairs, paperwork scattered around. Vincent turned to his crew, confused. "Where is he?" That's when they heard footsteps. Behind them, coming from the stairs. 6 men appeared in the hallway, blocking their exit. And in the middle of them was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was 5'10", 170 pounds. Not a big man, but he carried himself like a giant. He wore a gray suit, a fedora, and he was smiling. Vincent Cagney looked at Bumpy, then at the 6 men with him, then back at Bumpy. He tried to sound confident. "You Bumpy Johnson?" Bumpy nodded. "I am, and you must be Dutch's boys. Come to collect, I assume?" Vincent straightened up. "That's right. You owe Dutch Schultz $5,000. Protection money. You pay now or we have a problem." Bumpy's smile didn't fade. "Protection money? For what?" Vincent's voice got louder. "For operating in Dutch's territory. For running numbers. For breathing. Pick a reason. You pay, or we break something." Bumpy took a step forward. His 6 men stayed where they were, blocking the hallway. "Let me make something clear. This isn't Dutch's territory. This is Harlem, my neighborhood, Madame St. Clair's operation, and we don't pay protection to anyone." Vincent reached into his jacket. He pulled out brass knuckles, slipped them over his right hand. "Then you're going to learn what happens when you don't cooperate." Vincent swung at Bumpy, fast, hard, aiming for his face. But Bumpy moved faster. He ducked under the punch, came up inside Vincent's guard, and drove his fist into Vincent's ribs, hard enough to crack bone. Vincent gasped, stumbled back. His crew moved to help him, but Bumpy's 6 men were already there. What happened next was brutal, efficient, professional. Tommy Ricci went for his pistol. One of Bumpy's men grabbed his wrist, twisted. The pistol clattered to the floor, then an elbow to Tommy's face. His nose exploded in blood. Angelo Martino tried to run, made it 3 steps. One of Bumpy's men tripped him. Angelo hit the floor hard, a kick to the ribs, then another. He curled up, trying to protect himself. Frank DeLuca actually got a punch in, hit one of Bumpy's men in the jaw, but 3 others grabbed him, slammed him against the wall. Brass knuckles to his stomach. Once, twice, 3 times. Frank collapsed, gasping for air. Johnny Silvestri, the youngest of the group, froze. He just stood there, watching his crew get destroyed. One of Bumpy's men walked up to him, smiled, then head-butted him. Johnny dropped like a stone. The entire fight lasted maybe 90 seconds. 5 of Dutch's enforcers, beaten, broken, on the floor of a Harlem jazz club. And Bumpy Johnson hadn't even taken off his fedora. Bumpy walked over to Vincent Cagney. Vincent was still conscious, holding his ribs, gasping for air. Bumpy crouched down, got close enough that Vincent could hear him clearly. "I'm going to send you back to Dutch, and you're going to deliver a message for me. Tell him that Harlem isn't for sale. Tell him we don't pay protection. Tell him we don't work for him. And tell him that if he sends anyone else into my neighborhood try and collect, they won't walk out. Are we clear?" Vincent nodded, unable to speak. Bumpy stood up. He looked at his crew. "Take their weapons, take their money, and throw them out." Bumpy's men went through the pockets of all 5 enforcers. They took 5 pistols, 3 brass knuckles, 2 blackjacks, and over $2,000 in cash. Then they dragged the 5 men down the stairs, through the main room of Small's Paradise, out onto 7th Avenue, and dumped them on the sidewalk. A crowd had gathered, maybe 50 people, watching. Vincent Cagney tried to stand. His legs gave out. He fell. One of his crew, Tommy Ricci, was bleeding from his broken nose. Couldn't see straight. Angelo Martino couldn't breathe. Ribs broken, possibly punctured lung. Frank DeLuca was vomiting from the brass knuckles to his stomach. And Johnny Silvestri was unconscious, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. They were a mess, beaten, humiliated, in front of dozens of Harlem residents, who were now laughing, pointing, taking pictures. The message had been delivered, and everyone in Harlem saw it. By noon, word had spread through the entire neighborhood. Dutch Schultz's enforcers had come to collect from Bumpy Johnson, and Bumpy had beaten them into the ground. Vincent Cagney and his crew somehow made it back to their Cadillac. They drove back to Bronx, bleeding, broken, defeated. They arrived at the Harmony Social Club at 4 in the afternoon, 6 hours after they left that morning. Dutch Schultz was in his office, working on receipts with his accountant Otto Berman. When he heard his enforcers were back, Dutch smiled. Good, they got the money. But when Vincent and his crew walked to the door, Dutch's smile faded. They looked like they'd been run over by a truck. Vincent's jaw was swollen, possibly broken. Tommy's nose was a bloody mess. Angelo could barely walk. Frank was still holding his stomach. And Johnny had a bandage on his forehead, blood soaking through. Dutch stood up. What the hell happened? Vincent could barely speak. His jaw hurt too much. "Boss, we found Bumpy Johnson. We delivered your message." And he said no. He said Harlem isn't for sale. He said they don't pay protection to anyone. And then his guys beat us. All 5 of us. Took our weapons. Took our money. And threw us out on the street. Dutch's face turned red. 5 of you couldn't handle one guy? Vincent shook his head. It wasn't one guy. He had 6 men with him. They were waiting, like they knew we were coming. It was a setup, boss. We walked right into it. Dutch slammed his fist on the desk. "You're telling me that Bumpy Johnson beat 5 of my best collectors in his own club and sent you back here like this? What kind of message does that send?" Vincent's voice was quiet. "It sends a message that Harlem isn't for sale, boss. That's what he told me to tell you. Harlem isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever." Dutch Schultz paced his office. He was furious, embarrassed. His enforcers had been beaten, humiliated, and word would spread. Other gangsters would hear about it. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello. They'd all know that Dutch Schultz's men had been sent back from Harlem with their tails between their legs. Otto Berman, Dutch's accountant, spoke up. "Boss, maybe it's time to rethink this. We've lost over 30 men trying to take Harlem. Now 5 more have been beaten. It's costing us money, costing us respect. Maybe Harlem isn't worth it." Dutch turned on him. "Are you saying we should just give up? Let one black gangster tell us where we can operate?" Otto's response was careful. "I'm saying that every time we go into Harlem, we lose. Bumpy Johnson has the entire neighborhood behind him. He has eyes everywhere. He has fighters who know the streets, and he's not afraid of us. Fighting him is like fighting a whole city. Dutch knew Otto was right, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. For the next 2 weeks, Dutch considered his options. He could send more men, but they'd probably end up like Vincent and his crew. He could try to negotiate, but after what happened, Bumpy wouldn't respect him. He could escalate, send 20 men, 50 men, but that would draw police attention. And Dutch was already dealing with federal tax charges. He couldn't afford more heat. By the end of March 1935, Dutch made a decision. He told his remaining collectors to avoid Harlem. Don't go there. Don't try to collect. Leave it alone. It wasn't an official surrender. Dutch would never admit defeat publicly, but privately, he'd given up. Harlem had won, but the story doesn't end there, because what happened on March 12, 1935, became legendary in Harlem. The day 5 white enforcers came to collect from Bumpy Johnson and left beaten, broken, and empty-handed. People told the story for years, decades. How Vincent Cagney thought he could intimidate Bumpy. How Bumpy and his crew destroyed them in 90 seconds. How they were thrown out onto 7th Avenue in front of 50 witnesses. The story became a symbol, proof that Harlem could defend itself, proof that black gangsters didn't have to bow down to white mob bosses, proof that community and solidarity could defeat money and muscle. Bumpy Johnson's reputation grew exponentially after that day. He wasn't just an enforcer anymore. He was a hero, a protector, the man who'd stood up to Dutch Schultz and won. And 6 months later, when Dutch Schultz was killed by Lucky Luciano's hitmen on October 23, 1935, Bumpy negotiated directly with Luciano. They made a deal. Bumpy could run Harlem's numbers racket in exchange for a percentage to Luciano's organization. It was the first time a black gangster had negotiated as an equal with the Italian mob. And it happened because of what Bumpy did on March 12, 1935. Because he refused to pay protection. Because he beat Dutch's enforcers. Because he proved that Harlem wasn't for sale. Years later, Vincent Cagney was asked about that day. He'd left the mob life, moved to New Jersey, worked construction, tried to forget his criminal past. But when someone brought up Bumpy Johnson, Vincent's expression changed. He remembered, that was the day I learned that some fights you can't win. Not because you're weak, but because you're fighting people who have something to fight for. Dutch sent us into Harlem, thinking we could intimidate them, collect money, make them submit. But we didn't understand. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a community. And Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was protecting his people. We had brass knuckles and guns. He had loyalty and respect. And in that fight, loyalty wins every time. Vincent finished his story. We walked into Harlem thinking we owned the place. We walked out understanding we never would. That's what Bumpy taught us that day. Some things can't be bought. Some places can't be conquered. Harlem was one of them. And that lesson cost us 5 men $2,000 and all our weapons. But the real cost was our pride. Because Dutch Schultz, one of the most feared gangsters in New York, had been beaten by a neighborhood, and everyone knew it. Bumpy Johnson's wife, Mamie, wrote about this period in her memoir years later. She described how Bumpy and his small crew of 9 men defended Harlem against Dutch's much larger organization. She wrote about the guerrilla tactics, the ambushes, the community support. And she wrote about moments like March 12, 1935, when Bumpy sent Dutch's enforcers back beaten and bleeding. She said, people in Harlem understood that Bumpy wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all of them, for their right to run their own businesses, control their own money, lie without bowing down to white gangsters who thought they could take whatever they wanted. That's why people supported him. That's why they warned him when Dutch's men were coming. That's why they cheered when those enforcers were thrown out onto the street. Because Bumpy represented something bigger than crime. He represented dignity. Look, the story of Dutch Schultz sending enforcers to collect from Bumpy Johnson is more than just a gang confrontation. It's a story about power, real power, not the power that comes from money or muscles, but the power that comes from community, from respect, from standing for something, Dutch Schultz sent 5 tough guys into Harlem thinking they could intimidate Bumpy Johnson, thinking they could collect protection money, thinking they could make Harlem submit. They were wrong, because Bumpy wasn't alone. He had 6 men with him. But more importantly, he had an entire neighborhood behind him. The bartender who set up the ambush, the 50 people who watched the enforcers get thrown out, the hundreds of residents who spread the word, the thousands who understood what that moment meant. March 12, 1935. 5 enforcers, 90 seconds, complete defeat, and 7 words that changed everything. Harlem isn't for sale. Not now. Not ever. Dutch Schultz never tried to collect from Harlem again. Not because Bumpy threatened him, but because Dutch finally understood. You can't buy loyalty. You can't intimidate a community. And you definitely can't conquer people who have something worth fighting for. If this story about Bumpy Johnson defending Harlem got your attention, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we're dropping true crime history stories every single week. Drop a comment and tell me, could you have stood up to 5 armed enforcers the way Bumpy did? Would you have fought for your community? And turn on notifications because next week we're telling the story of how Dutch Schultz died in a Newark bathroom and why his final words became one of history's greatest mysteries. Remember, in the world of 1930s organized crime, most neighborhoods fell in line when the mob came calling. But not Harlem, not on Bumpy Johnson's watch. March 12, 1935. 5 enforcers walked into Harlem confident and armed. They walked out beaten, bleeding, and carrying a message. Harlem isn't for sale. And neither is Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz learned that lesson the hard way, and he never forgot it.